Lakeview Cemetery. Lakeview Cemetery is a privately owned, non-profit garden cemetery located in the cities of Cleveland, Cleveland Heights, and East Cleveland in the U.S. state of Ohio. Founded in 1869, the cemetery was favored by wealthy families during the Gilded Age, and today the cemetery is known for its numerous lavish funerary monuments and mausoleums. The extensive early monument building at Lakeview helped give rise to the Little Italy neighborhood, but overexpansion nearly bankrupted the burial ground in 1888. Financial recovery only began in 1893 and took several years. Lakeview grew and modernized significantly from 1896 to 1915 under the leadership of President Henry R. Hatch. The cemetery's cautious management allowed it to avoid retrenchment and financial problems during the Great Depression. Two sites within the cemetery are listed in the National Register of Historic Places. The first is the James Garfield Memorial, erected in 1890 as the tomb of assassinated President James Garfield. The second is Wade Memorial Chapel, which began construction in 1898 and was completed in 1901. It honors the memory of Jephthah Wade, one of the cemetery's co-founders, and was donated by his grandson. Creation of the Lakeview Cemetery Association. In 1868, prominent Cleveland businessmen Jephthah Wade, Henry B. Payne, and Joseph Perkins began discussing the need for a new cemetery for the city of Cleveland. They believed that the city's then preeminent burial ground, Woodland Cemetery, was too small for the growing city as well as overcrowded, ill-maintained, and not scenic enough. They issued an invitation on May 8, 1869 to about 40 of the city's other leading businessmen, asking them to meet at the end of the month to discuss the organization of a new cemetery. 30 of them showed up to the meeting on May 24. The group of 30 formed the non-profit Lakeview Cemetery Association on July 28, 1869. The trustees were William Bingham Oda of the W. Bingham Company Hardware Company, Himan B. Hurlbut Banking Executive, Henry B. Payne Railroad Investor, Joseph Perkins Banking and Railroad Executive, U.S. District Court Judge Charles Taylor Sherman, a Moss Stone Steelmaker and Railroad Investor, Weather South. Streeter Railroad Executive and Investor, Jephthah Wade, co-founder of Western Union, and Stillman Witt Railroad Investor. Wade was named president in Liberty East. Holden, owner of the Plain Dealer newspaper, the association clerk. The group resolved to build a garden cemetery in the style of Mount Auburn Cemetery near Boston, Massachusetts, or Spring Grove Cemetery in Cincinnati, Ohio, and Judge Sherman chose the name Lakeview Cemetery. Lakeview was non-sectarian and open to all, which in the 19th century meant that its intended clientele were Protestant. The group sold 7% annual interest bonds in association, hoping to raise $150,000 in dollars. Within 6 weeks, they've raised the money and set a new goal of $200,000 in dollars, which was also reached. Silla Chamberlain, Ironmaker, Railroad Investor, Banker, Payne Perkins, Stone Wade, and Witt held $60,000 in dollars in bonds, while another 11 individuals held $55,000 in dollars in bonds. Site selection, design, and construction. A committee was formed to choose a site for the new cemetery. Its members consisted of Holden, Payne Perkins, Sherman, and J.C. Buell, local banking executive. The committee wanted a location on the lakeshore, but found nothing suitable. While traveling on Euclid Avenue, Holden came upon the cemetery site by chance. The area was known as Smith Run. Beginning on the Erie Plain in the northwest, the site rose into the foothills of the Portage Escarpment. Delaware Brook, which bisected this site, and several small streams ran south to north through the area, carving out a number of ravines. The Delaware Brook ravine was particularly deep, and Euclid bluestone, a bluish-colored sandstone, had once been quarried there. By late September 1869, the Lakeview Association had purchased 175 acres of land on this ridge adjacent to Euclid Avenue. Within a year, the cemetery encompassed a frontage on the avenue. The combined cost of the two purchases was $148,821.84 in dollars. Located in what was then East Cleveland Township, the site was somewhat isolated. With the city pushing eastward at a swift pace, city and county government officials were already planning additional roads in the area, several of which would reach the new cemetery. Of land, much of it on the city's eastern border. This brought a portion of Lakeview Cemetery within Cleveland's borders. Landscape architect Adolph Strauch, who designed Cincinnati's celebrated Spring Grove Cemetery, was hired in October 1869 to design Lakeview. Joseph Earnshaw of Cincinnati was a civil engineer, and O.D. Ford was hired as the first superintendent. During the winter of 1869-1870, work crews began grading and laying down roads and paths, terracing part of the site for in-ground plots and mausoleums, and removing underbrush and unwanted trees. By February 1870, 2 sections were being laid out with a total of about 500 plots. The 300 plots in the first section went on sale on June 23, 1870, according to the Plain Dealer newspaper. The cost of a standard size and ground grave was set at $4 in dollars. Larger sites for families, monuments, or mausoleums went for 20 cents in dollars a square foot. This cemetery's distance from Cleveland's population center and the price of its plots meant that only those with a middle-class income or better could afford to be buried at Lakeview. Early years, 1869 to 1880. It's not clear when the first interments at Lakeview Cemetery were made, but several plots were in use by October 21, 1870. Improvements to an expansion of the cemetery continued over the next few years. The first ravine was British in November 1870, and in December the association purchased an unspecified number of acres that doubled the length of its frontage on Euclid Avenue. The cemetery sold $400,000 in bonds in 1871 to pay for more improvements. To secure the bonds, the cemetery pledged all but sold lots, roads, and water features. By August 1871, 6 sections of the cemetery were laid out, and the receiving vault for use by plot holders, designed by local architect Joseph Island, was almost finished. A superintendent's lodge at the front gate on Euclid Avenue was finished at the end of the year. By this time, several large, artistic funerary monuments had been erected at Lakeview. The association purchased another 41 acre of land in October 1872 and January 1873. It had spent $65,643 on landscaping, with 8 sections landscaped, plotted, and open for burials. The cemetery even dammed dug away brick in places to create ponds. Plots at Lakeview Cemetery in its first 3 years sold for half the average price of plots in established cemeteries. Plot sales generated little income initially. At the close of the 1872-1873 fiscal year, the cemetery was technically bankrupt with more debt about $198,000 than in assets. Plot sales were brisk, however, and the cemetery was proving extremely popular with local residents. As much as 40% of all burials at Lakeview Cemetery between 1870 and 1873 were removals from Woodland Cemetery. Another 21.8 acres of land were purchased in August 1873 in 1876. Of land in 1875, issuing $150,000 in dollars and 6% annual interest bonds to pay for it. By 1877, a plain dealer estimated more than $100,000 in dollars in funerary monuments dotted the landscape at Lakeview Cemetery. These included the highly visible obelisks and shafts over the Doe and Kelly, McDermott Potter, and to still plots the Goodrich and Janes memorials, the Keen's column top with a funerary urn, the Jephthah Wade shaft, which was topped by an angel, and the Halbert pillar top with a weeping figure. There were also a number of monuments with well-designed, expertly carved bas-relief or freestanding sculptures. These included the angel atop the Truman P. Handy Memorial, the weeping woman atop the Botcher and Hannah monuments, the group of angels supporting a cross atop the cross grave, figures carved on the upright slabs over the Johnson and Garrison plots, a sculptural group named Hope atop the Perkins Monument, and another sculptural group atop the Chamberlain Monument. Although a number of large mausoleums had been built in the cemetery, the newspaper noted that the most elaborate of these was the tomb being erected by H.J. Wilcox. Wilcox had visited Italy, where he employed artisans to design a vault that mimicked the look of an Italian Renaissance chapel. With lots selling quickly, cemetery officials used the revenue to redeem debt. By 1878, only $10,000 of the 1871 bond issue remained unredeemed, and just $30,000 of the 1875 bond issue. The trustees decided to retire both debts by issuing $40,000 in dollars in new bonds at 7% annual interest. Although the new bonds were sold, the old debt was inexplicably not retired. Building the Garfield Memorial. President James F. Garfield, a resident of nearby Mentor, Ohio, was shot in Washington, District of Columbia on July 2, 1881. He died on September 19, 1881. Garfield himself had expressed the wish to be buried at Lakeview Cemetery, and the cemetery offered a burial site free of charge to his widow, Lucretia Garfield. Mrs. Garfield agreed to bury her husband at Lakeview. Garfield was temporarily interred in the cemetery's public vault on September 26, 1881, then transferred on October 22 to an empty mausoleum owned and designed by noted local architect Levi Schofield. Even before Garfield's funeral, plans were laid by his friends and admirers for a grand tomb to be erected at the highest point in the cemetery. The popularity of the garden-like cemetery and the public's desire to see Garfield's resting place was such that large crowds began thronging Lakeview every Sunday. Roughly 50,000 people a year were visiting the crypt. The cemetery received no revenues from the memorial committee despite the wear and tear on its property. Cemetery officials began requiring tickets in the summer of 1882 to enter the grounds in order to control the crowds and maintain a suitable atmosphere for mourning. Relic hunters were so willing to vandalize the Schofield tomb they even ripped up the grass around it that a wire fence had to be erected to keep them away. In 1891, the cemetery barred all non-lot holding visitors from the cemetery on Sundays unless they had a pass. With only about 230 Sunday passes available, hundreds of people were turned away. The Garfield Memorial Committee selected the highest point in the cemetery in June 1883 for the president's final resting place. Lakeview Cemetery built a road around the memorial in early 1885 and began work on cutting a road from the Euclid Gate to the memorial site in the fall of that year. The cemetery also began work on making improvements to the landscape, water, and drainage around the site. The Garfield Memorial was dedicated on May 30, 1890. Lucretia Garfield, the president's widow, died on March 13, 1918, and was interred in the Garfield Memorial on March 21. Rise of Little Italy. Little Italy largely owes its inception to funerary monument maker Joseph Carabelli. In 1870, the 20-year-old northern Italian journeyman stonecarver emigrated to the United States. He spent 10 years in New York City, where he dressed stone and carved the statue industry for the Federal Building and Post Office in Brooklyn. Carabelli relocated to Cleveland in 1880, establishing the Lakeview Granite and monumental works on Mayfield Road adjacent to the cemetery. Carabelli began encouraging other Italian sculptors, stonecutters, and artisans to settle in Cleveland near his works, and by 1885 a substantial enclave of Italians, mostly immigrants, had grown up there. By 1892, the neighborhood adjacent to the cemetery's southwestern corner had become known as Little Italy. It was largely inhabited by Italian immigrants who worked as groundskeepers at Lakeview or who worked in the funeral monument companies making headstones or memorials for placement in the cemetery. 1892 also saw the city of Cleveland annex Little Italy. The annexation included all of Lakeview Cemetery west of a line running from the end of Brightwood Avenue south to Mayfield Road. Streetcar access. Lakeview, Collimer and Euclid Railway, a streetcar line, proposed a line to reach Lakeview's main gate in July 1874. However, as built in 1876, the line followed Superior Avenue to Euclid Avenue before proceeding east, reaching Euclid east of Lakeview Cemetery. The first streetcar to reach Lakeview Cemetery was the East Cleveland Railway's Euclid Avenue line in 1886. The company extended its tracks from its existing terminus at East 107th Street up Euclid Avenue to Rosedale Avenue in East Cleveland, just short of the major thoroughfare of Noble Road. The East Cleveland Railway opened a second set of tracks, an extension of its Cedar Avenue line, in 1889. This line began at the company's car barn at the intersection of Euclid Avenue and Coleman Road. The line travelled south on Coleman to reach Mayfield Road, then south down Murray Hill Road to Cedar Avenue. A year after the Cedar Avenue line extension opened, the Cleveland Electric Railway Company opened its Mayfield Road line. This line went past Lakeview's Mayfield Road gate. The line began at the East Cleveland Railway's car barn, went south down Coleman to Mayfield, and then east on Mayfield to Lee Road. This line closed in 1907. In 1902, Lakeview Cemetery gave permission for the Cleveland Electric Railway to build a spur into the cemetery so that the streetcar firm's funeral car could be used to transport caskets and funeral parties to the cemetery. Emergence of the financial crisis. As of 1888, Lakeview Cemetery had 300 acres of land. About had been sold, bringing in $406,000 in dollars. The price of a single burial lot had more than doubled since the cemetery opened to $1 in dollars a square foot. By late 1888, Lakeview Cemetery was nearing bankruptcy. Mismanagement was part of the problem, and the Plain Dealer newspaper said the cemetery's financial records were in deplorable shape. Lakeview had outstanding debt of $432,980 in dollars, and interest on the debt consumed $23,031 a year in dollars. Maintenance of the few open sections cost another $9,676 in dollars a year. Its income was only $23,875 in dollars a year on average. The cemetery superintendent had spent $150,000 to $200,000 in dollars on improvements, a figure officials privately admitted was too much. Lot sales fell below expectations, and the cemetery had never established a reserve fund to see the organization through difficult economic times. Cemetery trustees were aware of the worsening deficit many years earlier and believed the cemetery should stop paying interest on its bonds to bring its finances back in order. This step was not taken because the trustees believed many bondholders relied on interest for income. The cemetery began quietly borrowing money from the Citizen Savings and Loan Association, a local bank, in order to pay interest on its bonds. The association paid out only 4% of the 7% annual interest due on its bonds at the end of 1888, creating a severe financial hardship for bondholders who relied on the interest for their living expenses. Bonds, which formerly sold for $108 to $110, the par value was $100 now, began selling at $50 to $75. Angry bondholders protested the move but were assured that the cemetery's financial problems were temporary. Bondholders representing about $50,000 out of the bonds formed a committee in late March 1889 to seek more information about the cemetery's financial status. Quietly, the cemetery began accepting bonds as payment for lots. Usually purchasers held few bonds, with those holding large amounts of bonds refusing to sell. Although the exchange of bonds for lots would impact revenues, cemetery officials believed that only $7,000 to $8,000 in bonds would be redeemed. February 1889 proposed rescue plan. The initial plan to save Lakeview Cemetery, proposed by association officials, paid bondholders 3% of interest due in cash and the remainder in scrip. The cemetery would also create a sinking fund to redeem scrip. To generate revenue, the cost of lots would be halved to just 25 cents in dollars a square foot. The surge in lot buying, it was believed, would raise $2 million in dollars. In addition, spending on cemetery improvements would be cut back sharply. The reaction of the bondholders was not reported, but area business people began suggesting that the city of Cleveland purchase the cemetery. The plan was amended at the end of April 1889 so that all interest coming due that year was paid in scrip. Interest due after 1889 would be paid 3% in cash, 4% in scrip. The cemetery agreed to pay 6% annual interest on scrip, to devote all income first to maintaining the cemetery and second to paying cash interest, and to create a second sinking fund dedicated to redeeming bonds at maturity. Excess income after expenditures for maintenance and cash interest would go toward the sinking fund's redemption of scrip, a fund to pay the next year's cash interest, and to pay other debts. Significant bondholder opposition to the plan began to emerge. In June 1889, the Lakeview Cemetery Association paid only 3% of the 7% annual interest due in cash, the remainder in scrip. The cemetery was forced to redeem $11,000 in bonds upon that month alone as payment for lot. The redemption of bonds significantly impacted the cemetery's cash flow, and by the end of 1889 it could not pay any interest in cash. Income was so negatively impacted by the exchange of bonds for lots that cemetery trustees admitted on June 1, 1889, that no cash interest would be paid at the end of the year. All interest would be paid in scrip. The trustees also warned that scrip might not be issued unless bondholders agreed to the cemetery's financial rescue plan. Angry bondholders began to threaten lawsuits to personally hold the trustees responsible for the payment of interest. The bonds for lot exchange program proved financially disastrous. Lakeview sold lots worth $12,000 in September 1889 but received only $1,000 in cash as the remainder was paid in bonds. In the same month, maintenance expenses amounted to $5,000. At the beginning of October 1889, the association stopped accepting the full amount of bonds for the purchase of lots and said it would accept bonds for only 1/3 of the lot sale price. The cemetery also agreed to accept scrip for up to 1/3 of our lot's cost as well. November 1889 proposed rescue plan. Local banker and cemetery trustee Daniel P. Eels proposed in November 1889 to form a syndicate to raise $200,000 in dollars and redeem 2/3 of all outstanding bonds at the current market price. A trustee would hold the redeemed bonds until January 1, 1893, paying interest on them from net cash income. The trustee would distribute the bonds on a pro rata basis on January 2, 1893. Subscribers to the redemption fund were essentially betting that the price of their bonds in 1893 would have risen more than enough to not only cover their investment but also offset the loss of income from the reduced interest payments. Eels said the cemetery faced bankruptcy if the syndicate scheme was not adopted. Gaining acceptance from the bondholders was complicated. C. F. Polton, a banker and bond dealer based on the East Coast, held all $10,000 of the outstanding 1871 bonds and $7,000 of the 1875 bonds. Samuel East Williamson, a local judge, held $13,000 of the 1875 issue. Another 331 individuals held the remaining $10,000 of the 1875 and all $40,000 of the 1878 issue. Fulton claimed to have been given misleading information on the amount of outstanding debt by Lakeview officials, and he threatened to sue the cemetery to force it into receivership, a process which would take about 6 years to accomplish. Support for the cemetery's plan among the miscellaneous bondholders was about evenly split. Those in opposition argued it was unethical for the cemetery to create a financial crisis which caused bond interest to cease and bond prices to collapse, and then turn around and offer to buy those bonds back at the new low price. A recession hit the U.S. economy in 1890, followed by a brief depression in 1891, further depressing lot sales. By 1892, the grounds at Lakeview Cemetery were seriously neglected. Sections ready for sale were unmown, weeds and other plants grew wild, and erosion and drought had left some areas bare of vegetation. Only a small percentage of the cemetery's roads were paved, and the remainder, all dirt roads, were heavily eroded and rutted. Lakeview's finances were so poor that many residents believed it was close to bankruptcy. The association needed revenue so badly that its trustees considered lowering the price of lots so that the poor could afford to be buried there. The cemetery generated so little revenue that it had incurred about $365,700 in debt above and beyond interest and principal owed on bonds. 1892 approved rescue plan. With revenues extraordinarily low and the association not having paid any interest in cash since 1889, cemetery trustees formed a committee consisting of Daniel P. Eels, Henry R. Hatch, and Edwin R. Perkins to see what level of cash interest could be sustained. The committee proposed a new plan in February 1892. All 1871 and 1878 bondholders could turn in their bonds and receive a new refunding bond paying lower annual interest. To cover all outstanding debt, about $400,000 in refunding bonds, backdated to December 1, 1891, would be issued. They would have a $1,000 par value and be payable in 50 years. Interest for the last 6 months of 1892 would be paid in cash at a 7% annual rate. The new bonds would carry coupons for all other past due interest to be paid at a 6% annual rate. Additionally, redeemed bondholders would receive an income debenture equal to 20% of the bond's face value. Only $100,000 in income debentures would be issued, carrying a 7% or less annual interest rate. To ensure payment of the interest on the debentures, the cemetery agreed to establish a sinking fund whose proceeds would pay the interest. Lakeview Cemetery agreed that revenues would go toward maintenance and cemetery expenses first. Excess revenues would be applied first to the income debentures, second to interest on the 1878 and refunding bonds, third to sinking fund payments, and lastly to any reasonable improvements to be made to the cemetery. The cemetery staff believed that only about $4,000 a year was needed to maintain the cemetery. Interest on the 1875 bond issue, of which only $35,000 was outstanding, amounted to $2,100 a year dollar in dollars, while interest on the refunding bonds would amount to $16,000 a year dollar in dollars. About half the outstanding bondholders approved of Lakeview's plan, but it needed 90% to do so before the financial recovery plan could be implemented. The Cemetery Association tried and failed to get bondholder approval for its plan, and then turned for assistance to Harry Garfield, son of President James Garfield and a local attorney who represented several cemetery bondholders. Garfield felt the association's plan was needed to ensure the cemetery's financial stability, and began sending personalized and form letters to all the bondholders in December 1891. The cemetery's plan was tweaked to provide for even smaller par values for the refunding bonds. In total, $500,000 in refunding bonds were proposed, $350 at $1,000 par value, $50 at $500 par value, and $1,250 at $100 par value. 5 months after Garfield began his lobbying efforts, 75% of bondholders approved the plan. The remaining approvals were received in June 1892, and the LVCA Board of Directors authorized issuance of the refunding bonds. Legal work took longer than usual, however, and it was not until December that the bonds were finally issued. The cemetery's financial condition improved significantly over the next few years. Although some board members felt the cemetery should still be sold to the city of Cleveland, the board rejected this proposal overwhelmingly in June 1895. The cemetery board approved the erection of a crematorium in 1900, but no action was taken on the plan. Renewed improvement. In 1896, Lakeview Cemetery's entrance was unprepossessing. Located next to Mayville Road about 200 ft southwest of the current entrance, deep. All other tiers had lots just in depth. Also needs to have enough freshwater pipe for irrigation purposes, of new fencing around the exterior of the cemetery. Voidage retained the garden cemetery design begun in 1869 SFN and began planting large numbers of ornamental trees, including bald cypress, copper beech, ginkgo, oriental plane, pin oak, and purple beech. Importantly, he also planned a new entrance for Lakeview Cemetery on Euclid Avenue, with a new circle just outside the cemetery gate. The new office building at the entrance was designed by noted local architect Charles Fahrenheit Schweinfurth, and the cost of its construction donated by Hatch. Neoclassical in style, it was faced with Ohio sandstone. The $6,000 rectangular structure was 25 by in size. The floors and wainscoting were hardwood. Ground for the new office building was broken on October 21, 1897, and it was completed in April 1898. Construction of Wade Memorial Chapel. In 1896, Gilded Age Wade Room II decided to fund the construction of a new receiving vault and chapel, dedicated to the memory of his grandfather at Lakeview Cemetery. Wade asked the newly founded Cleveland architectural firm of Hubble and Bennis to create a preliminary design. He was so happy with their work that he chose this concept as the design for the chapel and commissioned Hubble and Bennis to finalize the blueprint. The association did not formally accept the new chapel until the plans were done. The site chosen for the chapel was between two existing lakes, diagonally across a road from the existing public vault. The exterior walls were clad in a white bar granite from Bar, Vermont. The interior decor was designed and manufactured by Tiffany and Company. The commission was considered so important that Louis Comfort Tiffany personally contacted Hubble and Bennis to win the job. The chapel featured a massive stained glass window at the rear and mosaics on each side wall. The stained glass window, titled Resurrection or Flight of the Soul, was designed by Tiffany artist and Agnes Northrup. Tiffany artist Frederick Wilson designed the wall mosaics. The five-rolled glass and gold tile mosaics depicted the passage of life to death. The left side mosaic became known as the River of Life, while the other had the title The River of Death. The chapel featured a casket pedestal in place of an altar. This pedestal could be lowered mechanically through the floor into crypt where the receiving vault was located. The public portion of the crypt could hold as many as 96 coffins. Two private receiving vaults also existed on the crypt level, closed off by marble doors. Ground for the new chapel was broken on February 19, 1898. The hillside was excavated 25 ft down to bedrock, and the foundations and crypt level finished in late December 1898. Completing the interior took much longer than expected, and the chapel was not finished until 1901. SFN the cost was variously reported to be $350,000 dollar in dollars, $150,000 dollar in dollars, $140,000 dollar in dollars, and more than $100,000 dollar in dollars. Erecting the Rockefeller Monument. In 1898, John D. Rockefeller, the co-founder and largest stockholder in Standard Oil and one of the wealthiest men in the United States, began the erection of a funerary monument in Lakeview Cemetery. Sometime before 1882, Rockefeller purchased a 17,000 square ft family plot on one of the cemetery's highest points, slightly northeast of the Garfield Memorial. 3 people were buried in the John D. Rockefeller plot. 2 of them were children of Frank Rockefeller, John's brother. They were William Schofield Rockefeller, 81 days old, died on March 17, 1878, and Mary Rockefeller, 2 years and 81 days old, died on August 23, 1886. Rockefeller's mother, Eliza Rockefeller, died on March 28, 1889, in New York City. She was buried in the Rockefeller plot at Lakeview on March 30. Construction began on the Rockefeller Monument in 1898. Quarried in Bar, Vermont, by the Wetmore and Moss Granite Company of Montpelier, Vermont, several hundred tons of rock had to be blown before a piece of rock big enough for the obelisk could be found. The Egyptian-style obelisk alone was 51 foot high with a bottom 5 by square. High with a bottom, high with a bottom, high with a bottom. The Cemetery Industry Trade General Park and Cemetery listed the obelisk as it was the largest granite shaft ever quarried in the United States, and the second largest single-piece shaft to be erected in the United States after Cleopatra's Needle in Central Park in New York City. The Plain Dealer newspaper believed it to be the tallest shaft ever erected over a private grave anywhere in the world. The first base of the pedestal was 14 by square and 3 ft high. Into the earth. The second base was high. The total height of the monument was 65 foot. And as the Rockefeller obelisk was dressed in Vermont, it had minimal if graceful ornamental elements on the base with the name Rockefeller on the second base. The New York, Chicago, and Streatley Railroad, the nickel plate transported the shaft and other elements of the monument from Vermont. The shaft alone weighed 80 st combined with the bases and the monument's total weight was 135 st. The obelisk was the heaviest item the railroad could move without straining its bridges. Even so, the railroad had to design and build special rail cars to carry the load and build a heavy-duty spur from its main line to the quarry. The Rockefeller Monument arrived in Cleveland on Sunday, February 11, 1899. A house-moving company used horses and a windlass to move the obelisk from the railroad tracks along Mayfield Road to the cemetery's Mayfield Road entrance. This failed to move the obelisk, and the company went back to using horses and a windlass. By March 3, the obelisk had only moved 4 blocks to reach Mayfield Place, now East 124th Street, and was beginning to make its way up the steep hill which Mayfield Road climbed. At that time, the movers believed it would take only 3 weeks for the obelisk to make it the upshore of its final destination by June 25. A derrick to erect the obelisk was rented by W. Fahrenheit Howland, the firm to which the Carrot Belly Monument Company had subcontracted the erection work, but the delays in moving the obelisk meant the derrick's use was required elsewhere. The derrick was erected again at Lakeview about August 26. The first base was put in place on August 31. The second base was cemented to it on September when using special French cement, and the die cemented to the second base on September 2. The obelisk was hoisted upright on September 11. The derrick's wooden superstructure proved too weak to lift the obelisk into the air and had to be reinforced. The shaft was finally lifted into and cemented in place on September 12 while a large crowd of onlookers watched. Stoneworkers applied the finishing touches to the monument on September 13, 1899. The Rockefeller Monument cost $50,000 to quarry and erect, and another $10,000 to move. Continued improvement, 1900 to the Great Depression. In 1900, Lakeview Cemetery had just over 10%, 34 acres of its land developed into cemetery plots. The undeveloped land remained heavily forested, with beech, elm, maple, and oak trees predominating. Financial prosperity. Lot sales were extremely high in 1895, 1896, 1897, and 1898, helping to improve the cemetery's financial condition and making its bonds well regarded for investment purposes. Lot sales declined significantly in 1899 and early 1900, but the cemetery still grossed $35,500 in sales revenue and counted more than 6,000 total interments by 1901. It had assets worth $1,119,302 in debts of just $626,290 in Lakeview was paying interest on its debt every 6 months, and the sinking fund was ample. The cemetery created an endowment fund in 1900 and put $7,207 into it in dollars. In July 1900, John D. Rockefeller gave Lakeview Cemetery a gift of $10,000 in dollars, the first of several donations. Rockefeller's gift was used to open a section for the poor, to lay fresh water pipes in several sections, and for other improvements. The cemetery received another $15,000 in dollars and other cash donations during the year as well. Lakeview Cemetery reported lot sales of $40,778 in dollars in 1901, assets of $1.19 million in dollars, and debts of just $626,290 in dollars. The following year, lot sales increased and the cemetery spent $25,000 in dollars to make an unusually large number of improvements, rebuilding old roads, adding new roads, draining some land, and opening a number of new sections. John D. Rockefeller made another $10,000 donation in dollars, and the cemetery received another $12,272 in dollars in donations from other sources. Lot sales rose again in 1903. Rockefeller made a third donation of $10,000 in dollars, and other donations totaled about $7,000 in dollars. Lakeview Cemetery continued to see lot sales rise in 1904, generating $55,230 in dollars. Donations brought in another $8,186 in dollars. The cemetery made $20,040 in dollars in improvements during the year, adding freshwater pipes, stormwater sewers, and building 3 tool houses each with a telephone in the cemetery. With expenses and supplies requiring just $22,148 in dollars, the cemetery had more than enough cash on hand for interest payments, the sinking fund, and scrip interest and redemption. Lot sales and associated revenues were even higher in 1905, $63,201, with expenses and supplies rising to $37,915 in dollars and improvement spending dropping to $14,840 in dollars. Lakeview was so flush with cash that it made an extraordinary $10,000 in dollars payment to the sinking fund. For the first time in years, Lakeview Cemetery Association trustees discussed opening a number of new sections and began discussing setting aside sections solely for the construction of large, expensive mausoleums. Section 23 Experiment and the Death of Hatch. The 1910s and 1920s continued to be years of prosperity for Lakeview Cemetery. Its maintenance staff had grown so much that it built an addition to its maintenance shop in 1909. It opened Section 23 in 1913. This section was pre-designed by cemetery staff, architects, landscape architects, and sculptors, many of them associated with the Cleveland School of Art. The landscaping around the lot's borders and its strategic points in its interior was designed to accommodate and complement only certain types of funerary monuments. In 18 of the 32 lots in these areas, the cemetery issued highly specific, narrow rules regulating the size and type of monument which could be erected. In the remaining 14 key lots, the cemetery strongly suggested to buyers that only certain kinds of funerary monuments be used in these locations, explicitly ruling out funerary vases. Headstones were allowed to rise only 4 and above the surface of the earth. SFN all local funerary monument companies were furnished with a booklet on monument design to assist them in designing gravestones appropriate for Section 23, and for all other sections at Lakeview. Lakeview Cemetery suffered 2 setbacks in 1915. On January 28, the cemetery's old 2-story wood office building burned to the ground. Maps, plot plans, and the blueprints for hundreds of mausoleums and monuments were lost. On May 20, Henry Art Hatch died suddenly, depriving Lakeview of the energetic and visionary president who had led the organization since 1896. Hatch left the cemetery in excellent financial condition. Lakeview was making so much money that cemetery was able to purchase $50,000 worth of Liberty Loan bonds in 1917 to support the American cause in World War I. In a snapshot of the cemetery's financial success, the trustees reported that it made a surplus of $62,165 in 1922. It had assets totaling $3,021,888 in dollars, which included an endowment and sinking fund of $1,704,737 in dollars. Its outstanding debts were $2,016,192 in dollars. Modernization, ownership of the Garfield Memorial, and push east. Part of the cemetery's success was attributed to its use of modern technology. For years, Lakeview maintenance staff had used 50 lawn mowers and 30 handheld scythe lawn trimmers. In 1917, the cemetery purchased a 2-ton truck from the Acme Motor Truck Company of Cadillac, Michigan. The truck was used to haul materials from Lakeview's quarry around the cemetery for the construction of buildings and macadam roads and the setting of headstone foundations. By 1922, the cemetery also used Fordson tractors to dig graves, place monuments, clear snow, and maintain roads. About 1923, Lakeview purchased 2 1-ton Ford trucks for general duty use around the cemetery. Cemetery shops manufactured a tent wagon, a grave wagon, and both metal and concrete-lined dump carts. Originally developed in 1913, the dump carts were used to carry earth from graves. Up to 6 carts could be attached to a single Ford truck. In late October 1923, the Garfield National Monument Association turned the Garfield Memorial over to Lakeview Cemetery. Most of the Monument Association's members had died, and its charter did not permit for a self-perpetuating board. After accepting title to the memorial in its land, Lakeview Cemetery immediately ended the practice of charging a 10-cent in dollars admission fee to the memorial. Lakeview also began cleaning, repairing, and rehabilitating the memorial. Increasingly, Lakeview Cemetery turned its attention to its Mayfield Road border and entrance. The city of Cleveland Heights, incorporated as a hamlet in 1901, included within its boundaries the southern portion of Lakeview. Cleveland Heights grew very rapidly. Its population rose from 1564 at the time of incorporation to 2576 in 1910, a 64.7% increase. By 1920, Cleveland Heights had 15,264 residents, a 6-fold increase. Cleveland Heights incorporated as a city in 1921. Lakeview Cemetery was the burial ground of choice for the upper-middle-class suburb. Although the Mayfield Road gate was locked, the cemetery gave keys to the gate to those Cleveland Heights residents who were lot holders. Great Depression and War, 1929 to 1945. The Great Depression put significant financial stress on Lakeview Cemetery. Those who had purchased large lots often failed to keep up payment. Cemetery officials allowed them to sell back a portion of their lots in order to retain at least some burial ground. When the owners of large lots defaulted on their purchase contracts completely, Lakeview threatened to disinter the bodies in the plot and move them to single grave lots in another part of the cemetery and resell the large plot. The cemetery responded to the economic crisis with retrenchment as well. It lowered the price of a single grave by 20% to $60 in dollars. The cemetery also cut wages for all maintenance workers and grave diggers making more than 55 cents an hour in dollars, and laid off 10 men. In response, workers organized a trade union in 1937 under the auspices of the Arborists and Landscapers Union, Local 344 FL. Manpower shortages hit Lakeview Cemetery during World War I and II as laborers enlisted in the military or were drafted. To assist in the war effort, the cemetery allowed large portions of unused land to be converted into victory gardens. Wartime inflation and the rapidly declining number of wealthy families in the Cleveland area hurt lot sales. The cemetery subsequently shifted its marketing efforts to focus on middle and working class families. Latter half of the 20th century. As more people chose cremation as a burial option in the latter half of the 20th century, Lakeview Cemetery responded by constructing and opening a cremains mausoleum in 1990. Any member of the public may purchase a niche in the mausoleum for cremains. 21st century. Lakeview Cemetery has been under persistent financial stress since the start of the new millennium. Operating deficits are common, and the LVCA has occasionally cut back services and staff. Even though the cemetery is a significant tourist attraction and the site of a presidential memorial, Lakeview received no local, state, or federal funding as of 2017. In 2006, the Lakeview Cemetery Foundation made education and tourism its top priorities. From 2001 to 2010, the number of individuals participating in officially sponsored foundation tours increased to 10,000 from 3,000, while the number of sponsored educational programs nearly doubled from 10 to 19. Lakeview Cemetery spent $5 million in 2016 and 2017 conserving, repairing, and upgrading the James Garfield Memorial structural elements. This included reinforcing beams and columns in the basement. In 2019, the cemetery began a multi-million-dollar project to clean the exterior and repoint any damaged or missing mortar. It is the first time in the memorial's history that the exterior has been cleaned. Lakeview Cemetery celebrated its 150th anniversary with 2 years of events in 2019 and 2020. About the cemetery. The Garden Cemetery is located in the Heights area of Greater Cleveland with a view of Lake Erie to the north. The burying ground had 285 acres of land in 2007 with more than 104,000 burials. There are 2 entrances on Euclid Avenue and Mayfield Road. The cemetery provides a plot in its veterans section free of charge to all honorably discharged U.S. Armed Forces veterans. Governance. The non-profit Lakeview Cemetery Association owns and governs the cemetery. Originally, membership in the association was open to anyone who purchased a lot, making the association akin to a church or a club. Members elected a 20-member board of trustees with 4 seats up each year and a board secretary. The board met quarterly, while a 5-member executive committee of the board met monthly. The board appointed the cemetery's president, vice president, and superintendent. Income from lot sales was used primarily to pay for staff salaries and the maintenance and improvement of the grounds. Among the many board and executive office positions, only the superintendent and the board secretary received pay. The Lakeview Cemetery Association reincorporated as a non-profit organization in 1926, with the LVCA now acting as a non-profit association for the benefit for lot holders. Annual meetings of lot holders to elect directors and officers were no longer held. Instead, a self-perpetuating board of directors was elected which continues to own and govern the cemetery. Lakeview's annual budget in 2012 was $6.01 million in dollars. Income from lot sales and services to families made up 60% of all cemetery revenue in 2001 and 80% of all revenue in 2012. Charitable contributions make up much of the remaining income. The Lakeview Cemetery Foundation provides a significant portion of this charitable income. Foundation donations were 6% of all cemetery revenue in 2001, rising to 16% of all revenues in 2011. As of 2017, roughly half of the cemetery's annual costs were spent on maintaining the grounds, headstones, monuments, and mausoleums. The other half goes to staff and office operations. Leadership. Following is a partial list of the presidents of the Lakeview Cemetery Association. The president oversaw the day-to-day operations of the cemetery along with the superintendent. Jeff H. Wade, 1869 to 1879. Joseph Perkins, 1879 to 1885. His death. Jeff H. Wade, 1885 to 1890. His death. William Edwards, 1890 to 1893. Timothy Doan Crocker, 1893 to 1896. Henry R. Hatch, 1896 to 1915. Douglas Perkins, 1915 to 1921. His death. Jerome B. So, 1921 to 1924. Francis Fahrenheit, Prentice, 1925 to 1926. Lakeview Cemetery Foundation. The Lakeview Cemetery Foundation was established by the Lakeview Cemetery Association in 1986 as a 501(c) organization. The foundation was originally chartered to raise money to repair and restore the James Garfield Memorial and to establish a fund for its ongoing maintenance. After the renovation was completed, the foundation expanded its goals to include enhancing, maintaining, and preserving the botanical gardens, buildings, horticulture, landscape, monuments, and areas at Lakeview Cemetery to benefit the general public. The foundation's new mission specifically embraced education and outreach programs. Although the foundation provides assistance to the cemetery in maintaining historic buildings and monuments and historic or horticulturally significant aspects of the grounds, it is both separately governed and administered from the cemetery. The foundation's 2012 annual budget was $567,000 Foundation assistance is not unrestricted, but targeted to meet the goals established by the foundation's board of directors and its strategic plan. Charitable donations make up roughly half of the foundation's annual income, although these can vary widely from year to year. Donations provided 65% of income in 2013. Investment income also varies considerably over time, but has averaged about 30% of all foundation revenues between 2002 and 2012. Service fee income is a relatively negligible 2% of all revenues. Notable sites and funerary monuments. The James Garfield Memorial is the most prominent point of interest at Lakeview Cemetery. The ornate interior features a large marble statue, stained glass, bas relief, and various historical relics from Garfield's life and presidency. The monument also serves as a scenic observation deck and picnic area. President and Mrs. Garfield are entombed in a lower-level crypt, their coffins placed side by side and visible to memorial visitors. Lakeview Cemetery is home to the Wade Memorial Chapel, which features an interior designed by Louis Tiffany. Behind the chapel is a large pond. The cemetery is famous for its numerous statues of angels sculpted in a Victorian style. A well-known memorial, the Angel of Death victorious at the gravesite of the Hasseroff family, was created by sculptor Harman Matson. In popular culture, the cemetery is among those profiled in the 2005 PBS documentary A Cemetery Special. Scenes of the 2014 film Captain America: The Winter Soldier were filmed at the flood control dam at the cemetery. Notable interments. Notable people buried at Lakeview Cemetery include Newton D. Baker, 1871-1937, Mayor of Cleveland and U.S. Secretary of War during World War I. Dennis Ball, 1878-1927, composer and author of When Irish Eyes Are Smiling. Francis Payne Bolton, 1885-1977, member, U.S. House of Representatives. Helene Hathaway, Britain, 1879-1950, owner of the Street Louis Cardinals. Charles Francis Brush, 1849-1929, inventor of the modern arc light, and businessman William B. Castle, 1814-1872, last mayor of Ohio City. Mayor of Cleveland Ray Chapman 1891-1920, baseball player for the Cleveland Indians Charles W. Chesed 1858-1932, African-American attorney and author Henry Kisum 1822-1891, follower of the Cleveland steel industry Henry D. Coffee Mary 1841-1912, industrialist, founder of the Cleveland Shipbuilding Company George Washington Carl 1864-1943, co-founder of the Cleveland Clinic and the first surgeon to successfully perform a blood transfusion Harvey Cushing 1869-1939, pioneer neurosurgeon John Elsa 1821-1903, actor and theatre manager Lethe Cousins Fleming 1876-1963, American suffragist, teacher, civil rights activist and politician. Alan Freed 1921-1965, radio disc jockey who popularized the term rock and roll. Abram Garfield 1872-1958, architect James Garfield 1831-1881. President of the United States Lucretia Garfield 1832-1918, First Lady of the United States Marcus Hannah 1837-1904, U.S. Senator and Republican Party boss Gertrude Harrison 1871-1938, professional golfer Stephen V. Tartus 1818-1888, investor and founding co-partner of Standard Oil John Hay 1838-1905, former United States Secretary of State and aide to President Abraham Lincoln Myronty, Herrick 1854-1929, Governor of Ohio, U.S. Ambassador to France Adela Prentice Hughes 1869-1950, founder of the Cleveland Orchestra Mortimer Dormer Leggett 1821-1896, lawyer, educator, Union Army Major General, Commissioner of Patents Outline in 1933-2002, owner of the Cleveland Browns Florist Stone Mather 1852-1909, philanthropist Garrett Morgan 1877-1963, inventor of the gas mask and the three-color traffic light in his cenotaph. 1903-1957, Cleveland Safety Director and a member of the Untouchables Charles Otis Sister 1827-1905, businessman and mayor of Cleveland Arthur L. Parker 1885-1945, founder of Parker Hannafin Corporation George W. Biggie Parrott 1883-1959, professional football player who threw the first legal forward pass in a professional game all ever has appeared 1839-1917, American businessman and organizer of the American Tobacco Trust Harvey Peckhorn 1939-2010, comic book writer known for the American Splinter series Dave Pope 1921-1999, professional baseball player John D. Rockefeller 1839-1937, founder of the Standard Oil Company and philanthropist James Salisbury 1823-1905, inventor of the Salisbury steak baked to striking cost 1906-2008, industrial designer, teacher, sculptor, and artist Heinrich Christian Schwann 1819-1905, third president of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod Henry Alden Sherwin 1842-1916, co-founder of the Sherwin-Williams Company Anthony J. Stasny 1885-1923, composer, founder and president of Tin Pan Alley Music Publisher at J. Stasny Music Company. Colby Stokes 1927-1996, Mayor of Cleveland, United States Ambassador Louis Stokes 1925-2015, Member U.S. House of Representatives Amos Stone 1880-1883, Industrialist and Philanthropist Worthy South. Streeter 1860-1902, Physician, Railroad Baron, founder of Streeter, Illinois, Ohio State Senator, first Mayor of East Cleveland, Ohio Mantis James Van Swearingen 1881-1935, Railroad and Real Estate Baron Orris Paxton Van Swearingen 1879-1936, Railroad and Real Estate Baron Jet the Home Wade 1811-1890, founder of Western Union.